Welcome to another episode of the Cynical Writer. Now, before we get started, I just want to let everyone know that the best way to support this channel is to purchase my books, and I've left some links in the description section in case you're interested. Now, why are period pieces so fascinating? Now, before I answer that question, I must first define what I believe a period piece is, because there are many different definitions of what qualifies as a period piece. Now, some people might be very surprised by my answer. I believe that a period piece is anything that takes place 10 years prior to the current period in which we are in. Now, some people might be very shocked by that answer, because a lot of people, when they think of a period piece, they think of something that took place, hundreds of years ago, or at least 60 years ago, or 70 years ago. But I think that's a very narrow definition, because I think that 10 years is enough time that you will see, at the very least, subtle differences in terms of how society and how culture and how technology operate. For example, it's 2021 right now. This video is being recorded in the year 2021. Well, 10 years ago, in 2011, the world in some ways was very different. For example, in 2011, most people still didn't have smartphones, or at least no one that I knew had smartphones. Now, I knew of their existence because the smartphone, I think, was invented in 2007, but they still hadn't become as mainstream as they would become later on. So that is one major difference between 2021 and 2011. I didn't get my first smartphone, in fact, until 2013, and I know many other people who didn't get their smartphone until around 2012. So in 2011, smartphones hadn't quite hit the mainstream yet, and smartphones have changed society and culture in many fundamental ways. I think social media has grown exponentially because of the power of smartphones. Communication has grown exponentially because of the power of smartphones. And also in the last 10 years, there have been certain societal and cultural changes in terms of values, in terms of morals, and in terms of ethics. Now, I'm not going to get into those areas because this is not a controversial YouTube channel, so I really don't want to discuss those things, but certainly there have been quite a lot of changes in those areas. And you could also look at other changes as well in other time periods. For example, America in 1960 was a very different place than America in 1970. For example, in 1960, the majority of televisions were still in black and white. By 1970, the majority of television productions had converted to color, so that was a very major change. In 1960, most men still wore tuxedos and fedoras. In 1970, a lot of young men looked like hippies. So there was a lot of changes in the 1960s in terms of technology and in culture. Or let's take a look at the year 1990. In the year 1990, most people still didn't have internet access. In 2000, most people did have internet access, or at least dial-up internet access. So again, that was another major change. Or let's look at the year 2000. In the year 2000, most people still had a box TV tube sets. They didn't have widescreen TVs. By 2010, though, most people had widescreen televisions. So my main point is that a lot can happen in just 10 years. I mean, sometimes a lot can happen in just 5 years, but I think 10 years, should be the minimal definition for what can qualify as a period piece. Now, obviously, the further back you go in time, the more technological changes and the more societal changes there will be. Because, of course, as time moves on, technology increases, and certain societal norms will change and transform. And so time is a very slippery subject, because you can close your eyes and then open them, and society can be very different. And this is especially true after the Industrial Revolution. After the Industrial Revolution, society really started to change in terms of technology and in terms of values. Now, there are other reasons, though, why period pieces are fascinating. For example, one of the reasons why period pieces are so fascinating, because it's very interesting to look back in a time period that you are separated from, that you no longer belong to, because it gives you a sense of fantasy. Because, when we imagine fantasy worlds, when we imagine Narnia or Middle Earth or King's Landing or something like that, we are thinking about worlds that we are no longer a part of. And period pieces serve that same purpose. A period piece is a time period that we no longer belong to. Therefore, we can see the differences between our time period and that time period. And so I think that period pieces allow for the imagination to flow and for the imagination to thrive in a way that stories that are set in modern times simply do not. And also, the further back you go, if you're talking about period pieces, of the 19th century, those time periods were just very aesthetically pleasing from an architectural standpoint and from a fashion standpoint, because I really do believe that in the past that people dressed more nicely, that their manners were more morally upright and were more morally, I guess you could say, virtuous than the way people behave today. And so, just from that standpoint, in the past, people behaved in a much more articulate manner than they do today, which is another reason why I find period pieces to be very fascinating. And also, when you get a reduction in technology, when you see a reduction in technology, it also means that there are more stakes. For example, if a character doesn't have a car that they can just get into and run away from danger, then that creates far more suspense than there otherwise would be. If someone doesn't have a cell phone, for example, to get out of a situation, that creates more suspense. So I think that in modern times, though, that there's far less danger when it comes to storylines in books and in movies, which is another reason why period pieces are so fascinating. And also, if you go back to the 19th century when there wasn't electricity, that creates a lot more room for description in books. It's a lot easier and a lot more aesthetically pleasing to describe, a scene by candlelight than it is to describe, a scene with electricity, because candlelight can reflect, in a character's eyes. It can reflect in a character's bone structure even. And so candlelight works very well when it comes to description in a way that the electric light simply does not. So those are just a few reasons why period pieces are superior. And of course, I could go into a lot of other reasons as well. Period pieces have a very legendary feel. They have a sense of myth about them that modern stories simply do not have. Now, of course, I am not saying that modern stories are always inferior, but they often are. And for that reason, I believe period pieces to be superior in many cases than to stories set in modern times. So I hope you enjoyed my speech for today. This video actually went on a bit longer than usual. Again, if you want to support this channel, make sure to check out my books in the description section. Don't forget to subscribe, and until next time, goodbye.